I spent an experience, working really hard on a piece, submitting it to a magazine, and ultimately getting rejected. And it was that feeling over and over and over again of being rejected. And I realized eventually, if I wanted something for myself, I would have to be able to, create my own initiative. But also, of course, House of Poetry's mission is to really spread that literacy across the world and, create unity amongst all different nations and continents and, tell people that, hey, there are writers who may not be fluent in English and yet still have their own story to tell within poetry.
Yeah, you're bringing up so many of the topics that I find really interesting about House of
Mm-hmm.
Poetry. Rejection is one of them. You mentioned that you had gone through the experience yourself of submitting
Right.
things
Mm-hmm.
and being told over and over again, no
Mm-hmm.
thanks. And it sounds as though you kept writing, but a lot of folks don't after hearing from
Mm-hmm.
publication after publication that
For
they're
sure.
not wanted.
Mm-hmm. So I guess one great thing about House of Poetry is that the same authors who end up submitting to my publication are the same authors that end up inspiring me. So, this feeling of rejection, it's not only one that I feel, of course, but it's one that, the authors that have submitted to me have felt with other publications. You know, a lot of the times because they're not native English speakers, they may not be the most well versed in writing poetry or writing prose. And as a result, House of Poetry is meant to be that safe space. Hmm.
And your gamble there is that grammar is not the most important thing, or the right vocabulary.
Right.
That there's
Hmm.
something deeper there. What do you
Right.
find in non-native poetry?
Yeah, so I think the imperfection there is really what asks the reader to, read deeper. Don't look at poetry in kind of this black and white binary. Instead, there's people who tell this story through, even the most simple language. It can really tell the most about any person.
You're listening to Therapy for the World, an interview series with kind, thought-provoking people working along the spectrum of self-care and world care. I'm Dan, a writing therapist and teacher, and this is my conversation with Brian Chan, a standout high school student and the founder of the House of Poetry magazine. We recorded this conversation in early 2024, so it's a bit outdated, but hopefully still fresh. Happy listening.
I think every single piece has this almost kind of intrinsic theme of family, of, everything you write, everything you create, whether it's art or poetry or whatever, that is shaped by your experience growing up. And especially with these non native English speaking people, they grow up in all sorts of different cultures, all sorts of family households that, share cultures that may be different to ours. And so, whether it be about generational trauma or holidays, anything really, everything is written, every experience is written into that poetry or whatever language of expression.
Sure. So it's family and also background, or the niche in
Right.
which
Mm-hmm.
you were raised, that becomes infused
Mm-hmm.
in whatever you compose.
Mm-hmm. For
There's a
sure.
refreshing quality to that, to reading folks who don't come from the same places as one.
Yeah, and I love that, that just all gets compiled into one issue. So, you read a piece, you turn the next page, and, you might go somewhere from America to the other side of the world.
Take me back to the beginning. So you did you wake up one day and say, "I want to start a magazine"?
Honestly, I had a lot of thoughts and ideas of what kind of literary organization I wanted to fund. Off of the top of my head, I remember, trying to start poetry circles within New York, within where I lived. Um, but I think ultimately, I had a voice of activism and I had a voice for poetry and for writing. And I decided to, you know, really combine those two and create House of Poetry. And Gosh, I can't even remember when that idea came into my head, but I thought of it and I realized, yeah, I'll make this work for sure. This is something I really want to do.
Why house? It reminds me of some of New York's
Yeah,
scenes in the 90s.
that's actually extremely funny. So House of Poetry, I initially started House of Poetry. Well, I'll take you back to the roots of Staten Island. In Staten Island, there's a big homeless shelter or homeless donation center called Project Hospitality. That's something I initially had a great interest in, even before, I founded House of Poetry. So my initial plan was to start a literary organization and publish homeless people's writings, give them a voice. But, that I'm working on that still, obviously. But initially, that's why it's called House of Poetry, because, I love the thought that homeless people aren't real homeless people. They have their home, it's within their community, it's within their shelter. What they're really lacking is a house. And House of Poetry is there to provide that.
That's a feeling that most of us get, even if we already have houses, right? It's a
Mm-hmm.
Poetry does offer that to folks
For
often.
sure.
This feeling of like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, I'm hugged by this writer. I'm hugged
Mm-hmm.
by someone who gets this experience that I have
Mm-hmm.
as well. Um, you also, so you reach out to two populations, it seems, and they do have a lot of overlap among them. Marginalized folks and homeless people. You mentioned that it's been a little bit more difficult to get the latter of those two groups to contribute or to participate in this project. What challenges have you encountered there?
Um, Definitely the biggest challenge there would be just contact in general. You know, just being able to say, hey, let's go up to the really busy homeless shelter and ask them if they have any writers in there. And that itself is, such a big task, not only for me, but for obviously the people who run the shelter there. So I've spent a lot of time volunteering at homeless shelters instead. And I'm trying to make that into my gateway into spreading that literary mission into homeless shelters.
It sounds as though part of the project is not just identifying writers, but also soliciting them, inviting them to write.
Hmm. Hmm.
Does that sound right? I mean, there are folks
Yeah,
who
it's
might be
really,
writers until they find
hmm
out that they could be.
right. It's really just that thought of self expression, of giving everybody that opportunity no matter what.
What writers are you inspired by?
Ooh, the big two standouts when it comes to my voice, when it comes to my activism, it is Toni Morrison and Ocean Vuong are my two ultimate favorites. Toni Morrison, like I think when I was 15 or 16, I read jazz and that was like, as readers and as writers, we have these books that kind of just like
Whack
milestone
us.
books almost like when it comes to like contributing to our voice overall, we just have these specific books that we can recall. We're like, yeah, that was the book that made me into the writer that I am. That would have been Toni Morrison's Jazz and I think Ocean Vuong's Night Sky with Exit Wounds.
His first
Hmm.
book, not the second.
Right.
That's radical.
Yeah, I'm actually a big fan of his poetry.
So let's go to the first one of those two books. What was it about jazz that, you know, took you by
It
surprise?
was, yeah, it was the fact that Toni Morrison, like, again, we're going back to the fact that Toni Morrison didn't comply with grammar. The type of writing, the type of voice she uses, if she wants to say something, she'll say it. Like, no matter if there's commas in the way, if there's periods in the way, she will say it. And that just makes writing all the more interesting. Yeah.
And Ocean Vuong's poetry. So he
Right.
his second book is the one that, you know, launched him to fame on Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous.
Yeah.
And it's
Hmm.
mostly prose, although it has some sections that are, you know, dabble with
Hmm.
poetry or that trouble the boundary between the two. What was it about his poetry that interested you?
Well, I think it was just the fact that I discovered his poetry first, and that became, such a huge part of my life to say, hey, there's an Asian American writer right here, right now, using that kind of voice, talking about his kind of
And
experiences,
also
talking about,
non-native.
right, exactly, and about, raised by a single mother and everything. It was just that quality of his that really resonated with me. And it was the type of poetry that, again, it comes to the voice I've never heard before. And that ended up influencing my own voice. His metaphors are insane. Really everything, his formatting, his metaphors, his language, dialogue, it's everything.
One of the things that I remember most about his book is the at the end of it in the acknowledgments section, which is generally this like pretty boring like addendum
Yeah.
to a book. Do you remember that section, the acknowledgments
It's
section?
huge. It's extensive. And
Yeah,
there's authors, there's friends, there's family. And I was like, yeah, if I was to write an acknowledgments list, I'd write something like that.
totally.
Hmm.
And it's like it pays homage to just all these people who have shaped
Hmm.
him, which is such a humbling thing for a writer to do. To say
Hmm.
like, oh my God, all these people, I would not be here if it weren't without them.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think he cites Lady Gaga too, or just like these folks that you're like, wow, thank you so
It's
much for for saying
right.
that.
It's just so refreshing to see someone really just talk about their entire life in terms of influences. And essentially, like, that is everybody's life. Everything we write is some interpolation of something we've read. Everything we say is some interpolation of what we've heard. Everything we do is made up of influences from people that came before us.
That's it's a thought that might bring some people down, but I'm with you.
Hmm.
I don't think it's a
Yeah, it's
depressing
meant to
thought.
be inspirational. It's meant to say geniuses came before you. You're made up of, genius. You're made up of
Sure,
everyone that has come before you.
totally. And then
Hmm.
you're the new amalgam of all of them, right?
Hmm.
You're in your specific point in time in the
Yeah.
world in your own space, and you bring
Hmm.
whatever they gave you and apply it to your own
Hmm.
context, to your own background and family, as you were
And that
saying earlier.
still makes you unique. You're not, not unique because of that. You're just, you're what everyone has given you.
You're part of a
Hmm.
lineage, totally.
Right, exactly.
You cite Kendrick Lamar as another influence.
Yeah, I think hip hop is, you know, a huge thing when it comes to writing. In fact, like rappers blow me away because hip hop just uses such complicated like rhythm. I think hip hop is so underrated when it comes to poetry. When we come to learning about rhythm, when we come to learning about intonation, the biggest, I think, rapper that influenced my voice was Miss Lauryn Hill. And, at first, like I had listened to Fugees, the score by the Fugees, and I heard the way she said things, I heard the way she enunciated things, I heard the words she used, and I was like, I can't understand it yet, but I really, really want to.
That's such a beautiful feeling.
Hmm.
You're alluding to the fact that there's not too big of a separation between a songwriter and a poet, or and songwriter broadly
Absolutely,
interpreted, right?
yeah. Hmm.
They just mix the two mediums, but we don't often think of musical artists as poets too.
Right. Hmm.
I think of Leonard Cohen, who wrote who was a
Yeah.
poet first,
Hmm.
and I don't think maybe he wasn't making it as poem. Maybe I'm making that up, but he just kind of like went this other direction and said, "Okay,
Hmm.
these are my poems. Now let me sing them."
Right. When it comes to like poets who became singers, I think of a really recent singer that I'm a huge fan of, Kara Jackson, who used to be, the National Youth Poet Laureate. And last year she dropped an album, Why Does the Earth Give Us People to Love? And it was this folk album that I absolutely loved. I love her poetry. And she dropped that album and it was, it's so beautifully written, it's so beautifully crafted. And I just think like the instrumental of music itself is almost poetry. It tells its own story, it creates its own feeling, it has its own rhythm, it's its own language, as well as the lyrics themselves. And I think Kara Jackson's music just really displays that.
I'd love to ask you about the process that you share with some of your writers. You offer the opportunity for feedback. It's not, as I understood it, it's not a mandatory
Yeah.
element of the process. Uh,
hmm
what is that process of guidance like with them?
Ooh, so yeah, that's a really good question, and ultimately it depends on the writer. Um, but what I think, what the point of writing is to make you feel something. And personally, I think like as long as writing makes you feel something as the reader, then poetry or writing has done its job. And so that's what I really prioritize when kind of quote unquote critiquing poems first or providing feedback. And then, when you feel something because of a poem, it naturally draws you back into reading it again, thinking, oh, what does this mean? What does that mean? And, so I start with the big picture and then I move on to those, small lines, to those small images and work on that.
How do you help folks write in a way that leads to the poem being one that makes them feel something, makes readers feel
hmm
something? I think that's a beautiful definition of a
hmm
poem.
I think ultimately just write what you feel down first. I think that's the most important part is to write your emotions as rawly as you feel them in that moment. And then afterwards, if you want to make that language beautiful, if you want to turn that into something that even if even things you want other people to read, sometimes you write poetry that you want to keep to yourself because it's just that meaningful. Um, so yeah, once again, you have to prioritize your feelings and your emotions when it comes to writing, and then you polish it.
Sure, then the grammar.
Yeah.
You work with folks of all ages, is that right?
hmm Yes.
How different is working with someone who's 14, as some of your cover
hmm
artists have been, and someone who's, I
Right.
don't know, what's the oldest writer you've worked with? Maybe you don't even ask for their
I
ages.
think I do. I never ask. I never publish them unless they willingly include it into their biography.
Oh,
I
wow.
think the oldest was 69 years old.
Why is that a piece that you need them to openly share?
Um, well, apart from being just a part of House of Poetry's demographics, just understanding what kind of audience I, maintain or I attract in order to, understand what I'm marketing to, what kind of vision I'm trying to create. It's just having people know that their age is not, something to feel, I guess, ashamed of because I think in the context of the society we live in right now, everybody has to do everything while they're young. Everybody has to be a prodigy, because, once you pass like, who knows, 20 years old, you're no longer a prodigy. You're no longer,
You're no longer relevant.
recognized.
Yeah.
Right. It's like everybody's scared of that plateau when they get older. And the whole point of House of Poetry is just to say, no one's too old to be a poet. No one's too different to be a poet. It doesn't matter.
Your plateau is non-existent, or at any age you're full of possibility.
Absolutely, yeah.
So that's cool. It doesn't.
hmm
It would also serve as an aid for those who are below the 20-year mark. I think a 14-year-old
Right.
might
hmm
not have felt worthy enough of being the cover
hmm
artist, for instance, and
hmm
yet this beautiful illustration.
It's, it's just about uplifting people of all ages, everybody with, their own struggles, whether about age or ethnicity or the way they express. House of Poetry is meant to be a place and, a safe place for everybody to kind of achieve the dreams, that they wanted when they were younger or that they want to achieve when they're older.
Yeah.
hmm
You talked about the urge to achieve at an early age, and I think there's no place where that's more
hmm
felt in a fierce and I would only imagine a kind of uncomfortable way than in an American high school right now.
Yeah.
I'm a few years out of high school.
Okay.
More than probably like 10. Let's say 10. What is it like to be in high school in America right now?
Ooh, what's it like to be? It, of course, for one, it depends on the environment you're in, kind of maybe the region you're in. But I think America's a place where creative expression is so valuable, um, and is so uplifted and recognized. And I guess that's both a good thing and a bad thing because, you know, then creative expression is almost sometimes to a point commodified where it becomes a competition to say, hey, who can, express themselves the best? Who can express themselves in a way where, eventually you're going to have to make money when you graduate and you're going to have to get that job. And so it's like you want to have a hobby, but like there's kind of this feeling almost that that hobby is going to have to become monetized one way or another. And that's a big pressure of just living in an American society as a whole. And I guess, this capitalist society where a lot of it, it's about money making in terms of, if I want to do something, it means I'm going to eventually have to be a professional at that. When that's not always the case, where sometimes you just want to creatively express yourself for the sole purpose of expressing yourself.
Yeah, and we don't even have to go to the monetizing aspect of it. It has to help you get into college, right? The skill, this hobby that you're passionate about, that's great, but how will you describe it, in your application?
Right, for sure.
It's also part of the pressure.
Mm-hmm.
How is that lived among high school students right now? Is there more than there once was? I remember it being pretty incessant then too, a feeling of having to build up your curriculum to get into colleges. Is it still that fierce?
I would say so. I'm definitely like no college, guidance counselor, but for what I can say as a high schooler, there's a big culture around Ivy Leagues or, top 10 schools or whatever that a lot of high school kids end up dedicating their entire lives striving for. And it kind of sets that mentality that I have to kind of market myself into something that other people want. When at the end of the day, the Ivy League is not there to choose you because they love you, which is a hard truth. They choose you because they want to brand you and they want you to be successful because that way you can recommend them to other students in the future and ultimately they can make more money. And that is the hard truth to accept as an overachieving high schooler, is that ultimately you have to understand that your self-worth comes from yourself, that these Ivy Leagues want you. You're not supposed to want these Ivy Leagues. If that does make sense.
Absolutely, it does. I think I reached myself like at this point at one, having strived to be accepted by top colleges. Once you either you gain those admissions or you don't. There is a day after that where then you have been taught to strive towards the acceptance of some entity above you.
Right.
And then it's like, what entity do I strive for now? If you don't apply to college anymore after you've done it.
Yeah,
you can apply to grad school and employers and this and that, but that upwards drive towards acceptance by this supposedly powerful and prestigious entity is kind of like drops away.
Yeah,
and you're like,
again,
and you're thinking about that self-worth. Go ahead.
And it's just that, again, that feeling of having to be a prodigy, being scared of plateauing, thinking that high school is going to be your peak because of almost like the image that top schools have set and the way top schools have marketed themselves to define you. Yeah. It's very easy to, be trapped in that.
Totally. How do you not trap yourself? It sounds like you're pretty well informed about this potential path that you've decided you're not taking.
I I mean, I'm self-aware, but it doesn't mean that I'm not trapped. I can say that for sure. There's definitely still that feeling, and you know, but I think starting organizations such as House of Poetry, that's something I can continue in college, no matter what college I go to. That's something that
Sure.
I put into myself rather than what something a college has put into me. I know I have the capability of keeping House of Poetry and keeping that mission alive no matter, what. So really it's my own initiative that keeps me going, knowing that I can do this all on my own, and
Yeah,
that's is what is going to get me into a college rather than having a college put that in me.
that's beautiful.
Hmm.
You've you wore and you still wear a lot of hats within the organization. I think you're outreach manager and editor and social media managers at once. You're I think hiring for those positions
Hmm.
right now.
Yes.
How did you acquire all those skills? Do you find yourself pretty savvy with the social medias?
Um, with social media, I mean, I think I've had to pick up a lot of skills while doing this, and that essentially has been extremely beneficial to me. When it comes to social media, I mean, I'm a high schooler, so I'm kind of on that every single day, almost every single hour, I have to say. And it's kind of an environment that I've grown to cultivate in myself as someone who runs House of Poetry, an organization with a specific mission in mind. So it really comes down to interacting with a lot of people. And luckily, with House of Poetry, I've managed to interact with many brilliant people. And, even in real life, I've, seen events on social media and I went to them in real life. And there I met tons of brilliant people, in New York. So, yeah, social media is a great place if you know how to use it responsibly, I'll say.
So you use it to meet your writers, and then do you guys have video calls, or how does the interaction work with them?
So we communicate most often through emails. And I mean, yeah, when it comes to, say questions, or in fact, there was an artist that I recently just called back or emailed back because they submitted an art cover for my second issue and they weren't selected at the time. But just now I was like, that was a brilliant artist. And, I emailed them back and they responded, and I won't spoil, but they're going to be the cover for issue 3. So it's really like, it's just really amazing to be able to communicate with a lot of people and understand their experiences for sure.
Does your high school have publications that you have either written for or participated with?
Yeah, so my high school has 2 publications. One is called The Quill, the other is called Images. And, both of them run with a very similar mindset. And it's just to, really identify campus life, identify who's doing what, who can we really lift up, and
Yeah,
what kind of
showcased.
organizations, can we talk about. So it's like all a matter of uplifting others and being binding ourselves to a community that we're all respected and loved in.
Yeah. So have you contributed to either of these publications?
So some things I've written. Currently, I'm in the process of writing a article about the Wish and Crane Project, as I mentioned, another organization I was part of. But besides that, I think one thing what we do is really fun is we interview new teachers and we're able to grasp, what kind of their lifestyle is like or what their beliefs are like. And so that in itself is just such, not only a great way to understand, but a fun way to understand new teachers. And that becomes, you know, publicized. So yeah, it's a great way to understand not only students, but faculty as well.
Totally. I was part
Hmm.
of publications in high school as well, and they definitely give you this sense of, being able to participate in whatever the
Hmm.
environment is around you, interviewing mayors or principals or
Hmm.
whatever it might be, folks in positions of power. But then you're reminded that you, as well, as an asker, as a question asker, as a journalist, in quotes, but also not in quotes, you're a seeker of information in your community. It's a pretty empowering thing to find out that you can
definitely
participate that way. Yeah. So
definitely.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, definitely, being in a room of creatives in your own school and being in a room of people who have the same goal as you. And this applies to every organization, not just necessarily a magazine. But with magazines, you're allowed to be creative. You're allowed to contribute your own thoughts and then lead on your own thoughts, act on your own thoughts. And so it's just that feeling of, everybody has, as you said, that kind of participation, and that feels, powerful to have a voice like that, and especially in your school community.
If someone wanted to find your writing online, where might they go? And also, do you happen to have anything with you now that you'd like to read?
As a matter of fact, I do. I don't know. I can't, off of the top of my head, tell you where you could find my writing. I don't think I necessarily published them online. If they were, a journal would have published them online because I constantly submit. But I was definitely thinking of incorporating my own writing into House of Poetry, maybe displaying some of that. But at the moment, I think even I, as a creative, I'm almost too shy to share that poetry with a large audience.
I feel that. You said you have something with you here. I'd love to listen to.
Yeah, this is a recent poem I've written, and it's kind of about a toxic relationship, or like power indifference between a man and a woman in a relationship, and it's called Breaching the Waters. Okay. First season clings to us like the aroma of sickness, and we are a grapevine of bombs churning wine between bed sheets, damp enough to ferment but 2 fingertips away from love. Her shoulder blades melt first, waiting to die in order to stay, everything opened but her hair tucked. There are splinters on the headboard where bite marks should be, echoes instead of footprints. There are walls instead of skin, hairs instead of rivers. She is bent like the word if. Her flesh softens like mercury, giving way to fingernails. Her mouth drops like sand. She breathes to speak, but only her chest answers. Across the ocean, meet a fortress instead of a church where the last man simmers. He guards his back instead of preying on a set of lips, his hair a mirror of waves, blacker than silence. He molds with stolen hands and ribboned mouths, jerking love because he cannot thirst for long, much less drink, much less swim. We are drunk off names we cannot pronounce. Lord, forgive us, we are sinners. But the water is cleansing him already. In the night's climax, nobody surrounds us but our memories. Daggers of light zip as we cry, fireflies from our tongues, 2 flames hoping to kill to survive, watching as our tears fly like sparks.
Thank you.
No problem.
A couple of things stand out. Just the third person, the third person observer of this toxicity, and the toxicity on the body too. So much carnal language.
Yeah, a lot of skin, being compared to like inanimate objects. It's kind of this dehumanization of people in toxic relationships, especially the victim.
Totally. You also have a she, he, we structure where it's a lot of she's, a lot of he's, and we's. I wonder how, I'd love to see this written eventually, but to see how it looks on the page. Right. I heard you say it, and it's a different experience we know to read and to hear poetry. What does it look like on the page? Tell me about the grammar, the capitalization.
Yeah, so, you've heard that I switch a lot between, third person and first person. And so that essentially is a gap between, maybe there's a group of stanzas in third person, then, a break, a physically written break. And then, we switch to we. And essentially what I hope to do with that is be able to highlight the difference between someone who's outside and observing a toxic relationship, knowing it's toxic, and what the people within that relationship feel. Because most people in toxic relationships, they might not truly understand the extent of what that is. And so it's really about conveying both perspectives at the same time.
Is it
And
a common feature in your poetry that you might change perspectives?
yeah, I definitely love, writing from different voices at the same time regarding the same, matter.
Yeah. Well, it's
Hmm.
proof of the fact that once we look through different eyes, we do see a different shade of that relationship, of that reality, whatever it
Hmm.
might be. Uh, it also lends distrust in a very beautiful sense to any one
Hmm.
narrative or any one view.
Hmm. Yeah, it's so important to understand perspective and voice when you're writing poetry. And it's fun to really play around with that, to really create different characters all in the same, poem or writing.
And the capitalization and the sentence structure, do you have
Hmm.
periods there or not really?
So I do have periods. I think, I write this, and I capitalize everything because I really want this to be almost like a matter of factly poem, because it's meant to
Mm.
display something that's, real, something that's, when people tend to, make everything lowercase, remove punctuation, which I do that a lot and I love doing that. And I think it creates a really unique voice. But in matters such as this poem, you know, it's meant to be what reality is. And I think I try to use grammar as correctly as I can to say.
That was beautiful. I appreciate that you
Hmm.
want to just state things as they happened, right? Matter of
Hmm.
fact. A
Hmm.
period works great for that. It's it's
Hmm.
declarative. It
Hmm.
just says this is what happened
Hmm.
with that face, just kind of like
Absolutely.
here's the
Yeah.
facts. What's it like being a poet in New York, especially? I think it's
Ooh.
such a city for poetry. And you're in Staten
Yeah.
Island specifically, I think.
I am. Um, One thing about being a writer, and I don't know if it's like that writer gene in me or that kind of writing personality that I have, I love being in the city. I think it's like, to a lot of people, it's overwhelming. And, at some point, I do agree that sitting can be overwhelming. But at the same time, there's so much to take in. There's so much, information to see. And as a writer, that's something that, I loved. It's so much to take in. And as a writer
What
who loves to write about everything all the time, that is something that's, really important to me.
It's stimulating.
Hmm.
The same thing that folks sometimes dislike about a big city. It's
Yeah.
chaotic. It's and I've said these things, so I don't want to mock those folks, but like that it's chaotic or that it's noisy.
Hmm.
You find inspiration in that.
Yeah. I think, and also New York is just kind of this huge, I guess, melting pot of cultures. And especially when it comes to writing, culture is a really important thing, and identity is a very important thing. And, New York City just has so many different types of people. I've been to slam poetry in Manhattan before, and, it has some of the most talented people I've ever heard there. When it was just a small, like, poetry event, and yet some of the most talented people there, I heard. And it was so inspirational to be able to just be there for like a few hours.
I had a similar feeling earlier today after
Mm-hmm.
spending several hours at home doing some computer work.
Mm-hmm.
And my house is sufficiently stimulating between the cat and the tree and the wind and poetry is everywhere we know. But when I finally left and got on the bus and went out to a yoga class, I
Mm-hmm.
enjoyed the ride thoroughly.
Mm-hmm.
Just to see thousands of people around me moving at
Yeah.
such speeds with colors
Yeah.
and different lives all around you.
Mm-hmm.
recently I was reintroduced to this beautiful reminder by Einstein, who we don't think of as a poet, but this reminder definitely fits within the within the characteristics of poetry, that you can choose whether to see life completely as a miracle or entirely not as a miracle. So like everything is a miracle or nothing is a miracle are the two options there. And poetry invites us to see the whole city as a miracle.
Yeah, like poetry, it's just, where other people may see things as stimulating, overstimulating, I see it as immersive and, diverse. And it's just such a lively environment to be in.
Do you have a sense of what you'd like to study in college?
I think a blend between English and psych, two
Ooh.
things that I think are kind of connected to a point, just understanding the way the human mind works, how perspective works. So, yeah. And I think, those two things really came hand in hand as an interest or as interests to me.
You see them as connected.
hmm I think, like, essentially, poetry is almost like, if you try hard enough, that is a gateway to understanding psychology, understanding the way people think. And obviously, there are different types of, psychology. But what I think of when I think of psychology is I think of understanding personality and understanding traits and understanding, how people choose to act, how people choose to think. And that's just something you see so often in writing, like not only poetry, but writing of all types.
And you would hear a similar comparison being made on the side of psychology. And as
hmm
you said, there are so many different types. Um, but one school among many, psychoanalysis, sees us as the product of our words, that
hmm
the ways that we speak are the ways our minds have been structured, that the language
Absolutely.
is the origin of the self. And
hmm
so you're, it's a completely thorough link between those two.
Yeah, I love that, just knowing that everything you say is something that you just part of who you are. Everything you say just makes up yourself. And I think language, like you said, is just such a big part of society. In fact, if not the backbone of society and the way people think. You look at activists, you look at, speakers, and you realize language is what's behind every action we make as a society and as people.
Totally. It makes or
hmm
breaks a system or a movement
hmm
or a
hmm
person. Yeah, for sure. So, what's your vision for House of Poetry further down the line? You guys have your third issue coming out soon, I think?
Uh, maybe in April, since
Okay.
submissions are closing on the 10th.
Okay. Well, okay.
hmm
That I don't think this show will be out by then, but maybe for the fourth for the fourth
hmm
issue, folks can be
hmm
invited to contribute. So tell me about the game plan for the next couple months.
I'm really hoping to create a team for myself. As you said before, I'm doing all this stuff, and I would love to just have a team of brilliant people, not to like work for me, but to work with and be
Yeah.
able to understand their contributions and understand what other people want in terms of the future of House of Poetry. And also hopefully introduce themes into each issue. So far, everything's been unthemed. I've been accepting poetry of all themes, but hopefully, I can create a strong body of work that really just works and, is cohesive but unique at the same time.
How do you think you might choose those themes later on? And are you thinking nouns, verbs,
hmm
sentences as themes?
Yeah, definitely. It could even come down to like current events or current feelings, especially, the world. Right now, we have conflict going on in so many places. Um, Really, I've been thinking just feeling, just the sort of feeling, whether it can be liberation or chaos. even, what you could say they're almost the same thing at some point. It just, yeah, I think it has to do with the way people are feeling.
Hmm. I love to hear you say more about that, liberation and chaos.
Hmm. Yeah, so I think, you know, um, I guess not to digress too much, but
You
almost the
can.
fact that, yeah, but almost like the fact that people want to be free. And I think language wants to be free. I think there's, especially when it comes to poetry, you could write messy poetry and that ultimately still becomes beautiful because that's your liberated thoughts, that's how you openly express yourself without any fear. And, that can be just as chaotic, but what it is liberating when it comes to language. When it comes to poetry, that's, it's such an abstract form of writing.
Yeah, visuals come to
Hmm.
mind as I hear you say that,
Hmm.
of chaos assembling into shapes, or
Right.
shapes disassembling into chaos,
Hmm.
and vice versa. There's
Hmm.
there is that original spilling out that you mentioned
Hmm.
as the origin of a poem. Just write how you feel, but of
Yeah.
course it's the famous shitty first draft is what results the chaos, the chaotic
Hmm.
and uncontrolled spillover of all the
Hmm.
contents of the mind, which then need to be organized
Hmm.
as part of that process of not liberation, I guess, but synthesizing, organizing
Hmm.
towards some sort of product that can be shared.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
And event spaces and beyond, bringing House of Poetry into the physical world.
Hmm. Yeah. So hopefully, soon I'll be able to establish printed versions of House of Poetry. It came down to like ultimately at the moment it's about making sure I have the author's consent, the artist's consent of publishing, and I introduced that into my new form. So I'm confident in issue 3 being published physically. So that is something that's definitely going to come in the near future.
That's super
And
exciting.
right, and hopefully issue 1, issue 2 as well. But there's still maybe some kinks that, has to be worked out first.
In order to print them, you mean?
Hmm.
What does that mean? That there are certain pages that are unprintable, or what does that? Yeah, what does that mean?
I guess it just has to do with the transparency between the publisher and the author. I guess when it came to, making issue 1 and 2, I'd only really thought of online publishing. So I wasn't sure if that transparency completely came through in terms of the authors that chose to submit.
Hmm.
But yeah, I'm also hopefully going to publish issue 1 and issue 2 physically because I know there are authors that are also asking for that. And a lot of authors just want to be able to hold their work. So
Yeah,
that's one thing for sure.
I appreciate how much you involve the writers and whatever their original intentions might have been. It's
Hmm.
really noble.
Hmm.
Um, and so printing the third issue soon. That's cool. Well, in April. And as far as institutional backing, is that something you're interested in acquiring, or how does one sustain a project like this?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's funny you mentioned backing because currently I attend a business class. It's called Young Entrepreneurs Academy. And, I'm learning there on behalf of my project, House of Poetry. And eventually at the end of that program, there will be, an investor panel, kind of like a Shark Tank thing, but on a much smaller scale. But an investor panel that I hope will, help fund House of Poetry, hopefully keep it running for the next year even. And a second thing is also implementing a small submission fee for authors because with a submission fee, and I'm going to introduce a fee waiver as well in order to not, compromise the circumstances of some writers who may
Sure.
not have that money. But hopefully with the submission fee, with that investor money, as a nonprofit, I hope that I can pay all that back towards the authors and say, you know, and hopefully House of Poetry will be able to establish a pay for authors who are published in each issue.
The future seems really bright for House of Poetry. I mean, an investor would
Mm-hmm.
be very bright to
Mm-hmm.
decide that this is a project worth investing in for all the reasons that you've described, you know, elevating the writing of folks who might not otherwise have a platform and encouraging expression from folks that were not necessarily given that platform before.
Mm,
Yeah, that's beautiful.
for sure.
Is there anything I haven't asked you, Brian, or anything else you'd like to say?
Oh, let me think. Um, well, one thing I just want to reiterate is that it's so, like, I don't even feel like I've said this enough, but it's so amazing to see people of different cultures really just come together into one body of work. And one thing I'd like to point out is that on the House of Poetry like submission form, I like make it a required question that people, you know, tell me why they pursued writing in the first place, what made them want to become a writer in the first place. And I have people from, you know, all walks worldwide telling them their own story. And I think that's one thing that really means a lot to me. And that's like all I could say. That's like, those are the only words I can use to express that. It's just so overwhelming having people, you know, tell their story in a Google form. People from any country and any culture.
Well, it's a feeling you've invited, right?
Mhm.
You don't just write that story if you don't feel welcomed to.
Right.
What types of
Right.
story? No, you don't have to reveal specifics, but you
Mhm.
know, what are the stories that you hear that move you so?
Oh gosh. There are, and I think it has to do a lot with age, the way we discussed earlier. A lot of it has to do with, you know, people who consider themselves ordinary people, like parents or, you know, at the same time, children, just saying, like, oh, I lived this normal life, but I want to become a writer so badly. Or I want to have that place to express my ideas or my poetry or, you know, any form of writing. And, you know, it's just a place to make them feel unique because they are in a society that like in a society that values so much, I guess, extraordinance, you know.
They'd like to have that space. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad you brought this up. Thank you, Brian. I have a couple lightning round questions. Unless there's anything else you'd
Okay,
like to say before that.
that's it. I'm ready.
A skill you're currently working on.
Ooh, I've been playing the bassoon for the past few years, and I have to keep on doing that, and I have to keep on improving. That's one.
A favorite way to relax.
Listening to music for sure. I
Mm.
have a bunch of vinyls behind me. You can see a lot of R&B, a lot of rap. Yes.
I'm gonna ask you again about that in a second.
Mhm.
Where did your name come from?
Oh, I don't know. It's not even my real name. Brian. Like, that's my English name, but I was born with a Chinese name. I have no idea. Have to ask my mom.
Okay, sounds good. We'll follow up on that one. An unpopular opinion you hold.
Ooh, I like Twizzlers. That's what I have to
Fantastic.
say. I like chewing on them.
Yeah, that's a fantastic answer.
Mhm.
100%. Book that left a lasting impression on you.
Like I've said, you know, jazz, Toni Morrison, but I'll also say, ooh, what else do I have? If I can say Percy Jackson, I will. As a child, Percy Jackson was like my book series for sure.
Yeah. I have a sense we could probably see some influences there in your own writing
Hmm.
too. Something people get wrong about you?
Ooh. Um, I tend to be really introverted when I meet someone for the first time, and I think almost like they have to open up to me first. So usually, like people might see me as kind of a shy, reserved person, but no, I have thoughts.
Yeah, that's fair. Oh, that's
Hmm.
I'd love to talk more about that one at some point. I'm figuring that out on this, show as well. How to
Absolutely, yeah.
how to open myself up such that others
Right.
also feel invited to do so.
I can tell you, like, I feel great on this show or
Oh,
on this
great.
podcast. It's been really amazing to be able to talk with you and to answer questions and to really have this conversation going.
Yeah,
So you're
man.
doing a great job. I can tell you for sure.
That's sweet of you. No, I feel a lot of kindred thoughts and journeys with you. Having
Hmm.
also, been dabbling in letters since high school, and
Hmm.
not having had the courage to create something like what you have. Lots of
Hmm.
respect, really. Okay,
Thank
and
you.
the one that I promised you would get to, a song or album you would recommend.
Ooh, I'm gonna think of an obscure one. As I said, Kara Jackson's "Why Does the Earth Give Us People to Love,"
Yeah,
and also Little Sims. Sometimes I Might Be Introvert. Those two are so good, so underrated too.
fantastic. Thank you,
Hmm.
Brian. Thanks so much for
Right.
this conversation.
Hmm. Thank you so much for inviting me here. It's so much more than I could have ever imagined.
Thanks for being here. If this conversation resonated with you, consider reviewing Therapy for the World or sharing the link with someone who might appreciate it. Until next time, speak with care and listen deeply.